Hi, my name is Todd Baltzell. I'm a retired detective sergeant for the Newburgh Dundee Police Department. I've been involved in law enforcement for over 28 years and have been part of the Oregon Sexual Assault Task Force for about 7 to 8 years. I can't remember exactly. So I just want to share uh, the viewpoints of law enforcement in regard to non-stranger sexual assault so that you have an understanding of where law enforcement comes from and how to work closely with us to maybe better us in our approach to these types of investigations. Thank you for what you do. So, first and foremost, on behalf of all of us who don't do what you do, um, we can't tell you how much we appreciate how hard you've worked. I know that you guys are working so hard around the clock taking care of COVID patients and doing those types of things. And on top of that, now you've chosen to try to become a SANE or a sexual assault nurse examiner, which is a lot of work. So thank you very much for what you do. Um, we know that statistically, some of us have been victims of sexual assault. And if I start talking about something that really starts to affect you, I understand. Feel free. I won't be offended at all if you choose to put it off for a little while. Um, but mostly just thank you for what you do. Thank you very much. So let's start off with talking about language. And language is a double-edged sword. You'll find that law enforcement refers to the reporting party as a victim. And why is that? Well, uh, I think it's more tradition than anything. I think our report writing uh, systems are set up to whoever is alleging to be a victim has their own slot that's called victim. So that's what we have a tendency to refer to. We don't use the word survivor um, only because we're supposed to be non-biased, and survivor kind of annotates that um, this is a foregone conclusion that this occurred. Um, Although it is a very difficult balancing act because we know how we deal with our victims is really going to dictate how successful we are. And the minute that they decide that we don't believe them or that we blame them, we're not going to get the information that we need. So we have to kind of walk that balancing tightrope, if you will, to be able to say we are non-biased and yet we show support for our victims. I think the next part where the patient is, where experience versus story, I'm not huge on language, but I think this one is very, very big. Um, when we use the word story, she told us our story, or her story was. Stories are usually made up. And I think that has a negative influence on juries. Has a negative influence on our victims. So we like to ask about sharing their experience, what they experienced, whether it is a crime, whether it's not a crime, it's still an experience. And story just seems to be um, feeling like they're making it up. So we choose to use the word experience. Um, Reported versus alleged, again, it's that balancing act where we have to be very, very careful. Um, Using the word reported works. Um, the reported victim, the alleged means that the person who is sharing their experience is making allegations against somebody else, therefore alleged does work. Again, it can have a negative effect on either side, whether it's the defense or whether it's the prosecution. If you use those terms, you have to really be careful and weigh out how your victim is responding to you when you use your words. And again, said versus admitted, I imagine you folks write reports, probably not as in depth as law enforcement. Um, but we have to be very careful about the verbiage we use. Um, I like to use the word said, because admitted means you're admitting to something that, again, connotates that you did something wrong. And we know from experience that the only way somebody can get raped is if there's a rapist present. So it really has very little to do with what the victim or survivor has said. Um, and if you use the term admitted, then it just kind of builds on that. Well, they screwed up. We're focusing on what the victim did as opposed to how the offender manipulated circumstances into getting that which they want, which is a sex crime. Okay, so we're talking about implicit bias, and it's really kind of a double-edged sword because everybody has it in some fashion or form. How we recognize it. I will tell you that people who engage in law enforcement usually has an implicit bias based on what the news tells them or what they see on TV or what they hear from people. So they can have an implicit bias like, these people are not going to take me seriously, they won't protect me, they'll judge me, they'll do those types of things. And we have to recognize in law enforcement that whatever implicit bias we may have um, really will reflect on how well our interview goes with our victim. If we go in, for example, you'll get what law enforcement calls regular customers, where you're there every other week on something. And it becomes difficult as a human being to separate that type of dysfunction with the person who is sharing their experience of what possibly is a very big crime. So we have to be able to check that at the door. And it can be difficult at times, but we really need to do that. And I also know that we have to recognize that when we're dealing with people who may have an implicit bias towards the badge, we have to be able to shove that aside and still work through the case as best we can with as much empathy and compassion as we can, so that we can get an offender accountable, held accountable. It could be stereotypes, it could be prejudice, it could be, most of the time, I think it's more the relationship that these officers have with their victims on a regular basis. It's very difficult for law enforcement to show up to the same house over and over and over again and see people at their worst. And yet when they come in vulnerable and need to report a sexual assault, we need to be able to put that all aside and be able to deal with them as human beings, as though we've never met and as though we're there to do a job. What happens when we're interviewing our victim, and everything that I'm talking about really is being shared at our police academy here in Oregon, in Salem. I can't guarantee that all this stuff is shared all over. Agencies vary from agency to agency. They're all different. We wouldn't expect a major hospital taking care of populations of millions of people to work the same way that a town of 5,000 would be doing it. So that's the variation that we have in law enforcement, is that agencies are going to vary. So whatever I'm talking about, this is what the standards are that we're setting for our recruits during the academy. This is what we teach prosecutors, SANE nurses, advocates, and detectives from around. This is the program that we talk about. It doesn't necessarily mean this is who you're dealing with, but we can at least try to get better and better and better. And who knows, maybe the agencies that you guys work with know more than we do, and they do better jobs. I'm all for getting better. So when we're talking about the cycle of mistrust, if we go in thinking that there was no crime committed, or somebody's looking for attention, or that it's just a complete waste of time. Um, our victims are very on guard for that type of behavior in their law enforcement officer. And when they see the smallest smidgen of blame or doubt, then they become on guard and they don't share as much information. And information is what's going to get us where we need to be. So we have to be very conscious of our facial expressions, our body language, um, how we deal with our victims, so that they feel free and safe enough to share as much as they possibly can. But if they feel that you are blaming them, then they're going to shut down. And what happens is that law enforcement thinks that they're being uh, cagey, or hiding the truth, or not sharing everything. Therefore, they become even more um, unapproachable for a victim. Therefore, the victim shuts down even more, and it becomes this vicious cycle, this horrible spiral where it ends up horrible. I can tell you that when I first started in law enforcement a long time ago, um, we weren't very good at this. And I can tell you that confidently that there were so many good cases that got closed out as unfounded based on the interview that we were doing. And later on, we're going to talk a little bit about what we teach our officers about neurobiology of trauma and how to interview the correct part of the brain as opposed to the incorrect part of the brain. And I think that was the cause of so many problems that we had in sexual assault investigations. Not that I blame law enforcement for that. We didn't know what we didn't know, but now we do. So now there is no excuse. We need to do a good job with our victims in the interview process. That is the foundation of what we build our case on. So coming out of the police academy, they should know, recruits should know about sexual assault dynamics. We talk about the cultural aspects of how our society deals with sexual assault. We talk about our own biases. We talk about just basically the dynamics of how offenders choose their victims based on accessibility, based on vulnerabilities, and based on credibility issues. We talk about neurobiology of trauma, where again, what we were doing was interviewing the incorrect part of the brain. When the brain shuts down, it's not working, and we were trying to interview that part of the brain, and it wasn't working. Therefore, our victims looked like they were lying or not telling us everything, and they would close out cases. Now we know better. We teach them about advocates, the importance of advocates. I can tell you that we've been doing trauma-informed interviews maybe for 10 years. Advocates have been doing it for about 40. They came up with it. They know what they're doing. They know more about sexual assault than anybody. And they take on so much for law enforcement, which becomes very, very important, because law enforcement has to write really good reports, has to do follow-up, has to write search warrants, has to do all those follow-up things. And when you're working 15 to 20 cases at a time, time is of the essence, but you don't want to lose your victim. This offers our victims, it affords them the opportunity to stay engaged and still free up the law enforcement officer to do what they need to do. We teach them about safe kits, the anonymous safe kits, those types of things, how a victim can go into a hospital and choose not to go through with their investigation, just want to get a safe kit done and have it stored in case they ever do get the opportunity or the willingness to come forward and hold an offender accountable. Again, trauma-informed interviewing, very, very important. Again, it's the foundation of our whole case. And the better your interview, the better your case is going to be, and the more opportunity you're going to have to hold offenders accountable. And then victim-centered, offender-focused is what we teach in the academy. In other words, we take care of our victims as best we can. We make them as comfortable as we can. We give them consideration for time. We give them control of the investigation. We do what we can to make this the most comfortable a victim can possibly feel, because the reality is, in real life, is their life is going to be blown up. They're going to lose family members. They're going to lose friends. They're going to be ridiculed in public. Worst case scenario, it becomes a national story, and they just trash victims. So we try to make it as centered towards them as we possibly can, while focusing on the offenders, what the offender did. Did the offender manipulate circumstances to be able to gain access to our victim? What vulnerabilities in our victim were present that the suspect or the offender was able to manipulate and use against the victim? And then quite candidly, we have to go through a lot of what vulnerabilities are, because vulnerabilities aren't necessarily just weaknesses. They can be anything that an offender can use against you. For example, the way we view it is this. We think normally, at least hopefully most of us do, think normally. We don't think like an offender. And so if you have a best friend who comes forward and discloses that their child was a victim of a sexual assault, think about the things and the responses that you would give. What goes through your mind? Well, an offender hears that and they see opportunity. They know that those defenses have been broken down by a previous person. They know what vulnerabilities they can exploit and how to gain access to that child. We don't think that way. And so it becomes very difficult for recruits to comprehend that we're not talking about normal thinking. We're talking about the way offenders think, and it's not the way we think. So it takes a lot of time to understand, okay, this offender is able to manipulate this vulnerability, able to access their victim by isolation. They're able to make their victims look incredible in certain ways. They're going to focus in on, this person is not credible, they're a drug user or they're a sex worker, therefore I can exploit those vulnerabilities and use it against them. So if they ever do come forward, then nobody's going to believe them anyway. If the detective believes them, then you got to get the prosecutor to believe them. If you get the prosecutor to believe them, then you got to get the jury to believe them. It is so difficult for victims to come forward as it is, but when you have offenders that think that way, they really have the upper hand. Okay, so we talk about defining sexual assault in certain ways. We have to go by the law, and the law is very explicit. So it does not mean that a person doesn't feel violated if the law has not been broken. For example, if somebody engages in sexual activity willingly and wants to do that, and they engage in it enthusiastically, they just have a request, please don't ejaculate inside of me. But the male does. They can come into the police department and report that they were raped because the guy ejaculated inside of them. Well, that's not what the law considers to be a crime. Therefore, you may have a victim of what they feel to be violated, but it doesn't mean that it fits within the law. So we have to go by what the law is for our jurisdictions and match up what the victim is saying with what the law says. We have to overcome myths and misconceptions. And it isn't just law enforcement, because I think law enforcement's transcended past a lot of those. I think prosecutors have transcended much further. They know it isn't a white van with a guy that has a mustache or whatever, and it could be anybody that commits these crimes. The problem, and the reason why we talk about these myths and misconceptions, is because a lot of our victims have them. For example, if you're involved in a domestic violent relationship with somebody that is very characterologically in control of their victim and uses sexual assault on a regular basis, our victims may not see that as rape. They may see it as just part of life. So we need to be aware of these misconceptions and how to ask the questions appropriately so that we can get around those myths and misconceptions of what people in society have. We go over sexual assault statistics. Statistics are kind of difficult in that they can change drastically over time. They're only as good as the research that was done on them and the algorithms that are applied to them. But we do know this, at least from anecdotal evidence. I can tell you that working sexual assault cases is like digging a hole in the sand. It just never gets empty. It always keeps coming and coming and coming. So we use the CDC statistics for law enforcement officers. I think in Oregon, it's 1 in 4 women have been a victim of rape. That's adult women. That doesn't include men. It doesn't include children, and it doesn't include sexual assault other than rape. So we know that it's just epidemic, if not pandemic type of numbers. And we want to make sure that our officers understand that this happens, and it happens a lot. And when you get these calls, you have to treat them as though a crime has been committed, going into it with the mentality that a crime has been committed until you can prove otherwise. So these are some of the myths and misconceptions. And again, we have to train our officers that even though we may not believe this, that rapes happen outside and this guy in a white van with Velcro shoes, or a guy in a hoodie, or in a dark park or in an alleyway. We understand that's not the case. That's not how most rapists work. Although it does happen, it doesn't happen as often as non-stranger sexual assault. So what we train our officers is, even if you may not believe this, and maybe if you've transcended above this belief that it's always strangers and stuff like that, that doesn't mean your juries don't. Your juries want your victims to be pure and your suspects to be evil. And when it turns out to be the other way, where you have a sex worker or a drug addict or somebody who has dysfunction constantly and meeting with law enforcement because they're belligerent or drunk in a bar, our juries do not want to see that. They want our victims to be pure. And when you have somebody that is well respected with hyper credibility in the community, people don't want to see that are offenders. People don't want to see that either. So we have to overcome that when we present our case to the prosecutor, and the prosecutor presents the case to the jury, in order to hold offenders accountable. We talk a lot about false reports. And again, I think that the misconceptions about false reporting is based on how we used to interview, and catching our victims contradicting themselves, and not understanding how trauma affects the brain, not only as far as their actions and reactions of what's going on, but as well as their memory recall. So we talk about false reports to show officers that you can't go into these cases thinking it's quote baloney or whatever, because you will get a lot of that from officers. Well, she said she was raped by a clown. I don't believe her. Well, we don't know. So we teach based on research that false reports are about between 2 and 8% of the time. Doesn't mean they don't happen, but it does mean that chances are very, very good that this person is reporting something that actually occurred. Now let's apply it to the law and see if there's an association with the law and what actually occurred. And this basically is pretty consistent. You'll have burglary complaints. Between 2 and 8% of them are people trying to get insurance money, but for the most part, 98 to 92% are actually crimes. So let's do our job. Let's find out the truth. Let's apply the law to what actually occurred, and we'll go from there. Again, we talked about this a little bit. I won't spend a whole lot of time on it. Thanks to shows that have been on TV forever, society has been groomed to think that rapes happen in an alley by a stranger. Really, we talk about first person, second persona, and third persona in the academy, in that when it's a non-stranger sexual assault, basically my third persona is what you see. It's hopefully my best foot forward. You see what you see, but you really don't know a lot about me. Now, my second persona is something I open up a little bit more to, like my wife. She knows me better than anyone. My kids know me better than anyone. That's my second persona. But my third persona is somebody that nobody ever sees, except for victims of sexual assault. This person that they thought were such good friends, when they trusted them to come over and watch Netflix and have a couple beers and just chill for the evening. That's a modern term, I use that. But when that person changes into somebody they've never seen, that third persona, it throws off our victims completely. And they don't know how to react. They don't know what to do, because this person that they were with, they thought they knew, is a completely different person. If they're a completely different person and willing to engage in a sexual assault, what makes them think that they're not willing to kill them afterwards or during? And therefore, the trauma kicks in, because this is a vast betrayal of what this friend was supposed to be. And that's what happens most of the time. And that's why we try to get away from the stranger, although it's important to investigate stranger rape, and we do cover that in the academy, but the vast majority is going to be from somebody they know. See, 45% acquaintance, 25% current or former significant other, and only 28% are stranger crimes. From my career, my anecdotal evidence, I don't even know if it's that high. I think I worked 3 stranger rapes in my 28 years with thousands and thousands of non-stranger rapes. So let's just say that a stranger rape is bad and it needs to be investigated, and that person needs to be held accountable. But if we just focus on that, then we're missing the vast majority of these cases. And again, you will find that our offenders, again, need to isolate. They need to have accessibility to their victims. And the best way to do that is to get to know them and find out what their victim or vulnerabilities are and manipulate those, and then try to establish any credibility issues that you can, so that if they ever do come forward, that they don't look credible. Outside, yeah, it can happen. But for the most part, it's not that common. Yeah, it's going to happen either at the offender's home or a friend's home or the victim's home. It's just going to happen somewhere where the offender can isolate and access their victim. This is an interesting thing. Don't hold this, because this is off the top of my head. I think it was 1998 when our government got a little bit smarter in regard to rape, because you used to have to prove earnest resistance and show that the victim fought back as hard as they could before it became rape. We know through the neurobiology of trauma that we can't expect that um, that some people go into tonic immobility or acquiescent immobility, all those types of things, quiescent, I should say, mobility, um, that does not allow for them to fight back. Matter of fact, it doesn't even allow for them to move very much. Um, and we have to also look at it common sense like, in that if you had your choice between getting raped or getting the crap beat out of you and then raped, which one are you going to do? You're probably going to do whatever you think is right just to survive, to get out of there, to make it get done with. And fighting back just escalates the problem. And we can't expect our victims to fight back on somebody that already may have a huge advantage over them. And fighting back just should not be and is not uh, an element of the crime. Yeah, again, statistics, 70% of the female victims fearing for their lives if they put up any resistance. And that just is common sense. Think about it. If it were you, you're going to do whatever it takes to just get through it. And we started to recognize that. And now we are getting over that as far as making it an element of the crime, fighting back, and those things. It just should not happen. Okay, so what we teach, and I don't pretend to teach nurses about the brain, because I'm sure you know more about it, but I can tell you what we teach our people. Our people is that when somebody goes into trauma, when their body senses that trauma is going to occur, their prefrontal cortex is shut down. It diverts back to the primitive brain, which is the amygdala, and we teach them about all the chemicals that go through the body, the oxytocin, the opioids, the cortisol, those types of things, and those effects that they have on the body, which causes people to either go into tonic immobility or to react in a manner that doesn't really make sense. For example, if you're interviewing your victim and you find out she fell asleep in the suspect's bed after the rape, that might be counterintuitive to thinking, well, this has got to be traumatic. But when you look at it in terms of what chemicals are going through the body and how that adrenaline dump just wipes you out afterwards, it does cause people to go to sleep. When people talk about their experience and they have all kinds of oxytocin going through their body and they just start to smile, they start to laugh during the interview, again, it's counterintuitive to thinking, wow, this was not very traumatic for our victim. In fact, it was. That was an oxytocin dump going through their body that just to deal with it. We teach them when we interview them to shut up, basically. We have specific questions that we ask, and it starts off with after we've made sure that they're comfortable, after we're sure that their needs have been met, if they're thirsty, if they need to use the restroom, what the room temperature is, do they feel comfortable with whoever's in the room, whether it be an advocate, me, or somebody that they want. After that's all done, then we just start off with, what are you able to tell me about your experience? And just let them talk. Don't interrupt them. Don't stop them. Don't fill in the gaps. You will fill in the gaps later. Let them talk until they're done talking. You'll get far more information. During that time, what we're doing is we're writing down questions. For example, if our victim comes in and says, I went out for drinks with my friends at a bar, I met this guy, and he took me back to his house, and that's when he raped me. If you stop them and say, well, wait a minute, stop. What are the names of your friends? Well, now they're engaging a different part of the brain. So they have to stop accessing the traumatic part of the brain, go into the other part of the brain to gather that information, give you that information, and then find where they left off while talking about their experience. That doesn't work. They get lost, they forget things. If we just shut up and listen, we will get so much more information. We can fill in those gaps later as they're talking. We're writing down questions and based on, okay, what are the names of your friends? But we're not going to talk about sequential uh, expectations. In other words, then what happened, then what happened, then what happened. If you imagine each dot in a series of dots is a thought that the victim wants to share with you in regard to their experience, you let them talk about each dot and they won't connect right. They won't be in sequence. They won't be in order, but you just keep letting them talk. Then when it comes time and they're finished, then we go back. And instead of connecting those dots, we're going to expand those dots. We're going to build on what they already know. You told me that you went to a bar with your friends. Can you tell me anything more about the bar? Let them expand that dot. Find out that they have a relationship with the bartender and the bartender knows everybody. And so we know who to follow up with in regard to the events leading up to the incident. And then afterwards, we want to do the events afterwards. So we teach them to not be thrown off by their reactions when they're talking, because that's chemical. We teach them that disclosure is a process, not an event. If they need more than one chance to share their experience, then we're going to give it to them. If they need a whole bunch of chances, we're going to give it to them. Because we know that if you're involved in a traumatic incident, you're not going to remember everything right away. And it's unfair to expect our victims to do that. We do talk about the sensory type of qualities that the amygdala has when you're interviewing your victims. And we'll talk about feelings and thoughts, but also about senses. We ask the questions, are you able to tell me what you were smelling at that time? Now, what that does, it does trigger the amygdala and it puts them in that area, but it also affords us a chance to corroborate those senses. When they describe how their offender was wearing all that Axe perfume, we write a search warrant for that Axe perfume. And what we're going to do, what our ultimate goal, and we'll talk a little bit more about this, is we want the jury not just to hear their victims as though they were witnesses to their own crime. We want the jury to experience what our victim experienced. We want them to smell what they were smelling. We want them to see what they were seeing. We want them to at least know what they were feeling. People know what it's like to have a tongue jam down your throat with somebody that smokes cigarettes and the gagging feeling or something that, no offense to anybody that smokes cigarettes, but if it's a sexual assault, they're going to remember those tastes. They're going to remember those smells. We want our jury to experience that. If our offender cranks up music as loud as he possibly can, we find out what music he was playing. We're going to go into his house. We're going to take it and we're going to bring it to court. And hopefully the prosecutor will be able to bring that volume up to the victim so that they can recall and let the jury know how loud that music was. These small micro corroborations are very, very important to at least share what the victim is sharing in regard to their experience. And again, we don't try to connect the dots. We try to build on whatever they told us. Tell me, are you able to tell me more about the bar? Are you able to tell me more about the offender's apartment? Are you able to tell me more about what you were feeling? Use words like help me understand. Those types of things really not only bonds with your victim, they don't feel as though they're being judged. They don't feel as though they're being blamed. And yet we're getting as much, if not way more information than we ever could before we started doing this. Now, this is where things change. One size does not fit all in any of these cases, even within the same department. Um, some departments are so big they have call takers, patrol officers that are shagging calls. They do the initial investigation really quick and determine if they're going to call in detectives right then and there. Other departments, like mine, where you have a population of around 25,000 people, uh, when you get it, you work it. And that could be determinative on how you set up these interviews. If it's a very busy police department where you have call takers, they may do a preliminary interview just to get the who, what, when, where, why, and how, um, and then call in a detective for the more detailed follow-up interview, because that detailed follow-up interview is going to take hours. But we also have to recognize that you got to give your victim what they need. If you can imagine somebody getting up at 6 o'clock in the morning to go to work, and then after work deciding to go out to drinks with their friends, so they go home, they get freshened up, and they meet their friends at 7 o'clock in the evening, and then they end up staying there for a couple hours, having a couple drinks, and the victim ends up meeting their offender and ends up going back to his house or something. You're talking hours and hours and hours. And then afterwards, they have to go home and decide if they're going to call the police, or they may call a friend who tells them to call the police. They may choose to go to the hospital. But we're talking they've been up for 13, 14 hours already. And you know as well as I do, SANE examinations take a long, long time. Maybe interviewing is not the best interest of your victim at that time. Maybe giving them a day or two to just rest and relax and compose themselves is the better choice. But maybe it's not. Maybe it's an acute case where they want to hold the offender accountable and they don't care if they're up for 24 hours. You can't just say one way is going to work and the other way isn't. You just have to adapt as things go. We have to keep in consideration what our crime scenes are. If we need to collect evidence, if it's fleeting, do we need to get that search warrant right away? Or is it better off that we do other type of investigative techniques before we serve a search warrant where the offender knows what's going on? So everything is fluid, and we have to teach them that if you want me to tell you step by step, it's not going to work. You have to adapt to whatever your victim needs and whatever the incident requires you to do. And again, we show them what the SAFE kit is and what the SANE examination entails, so they have a good understanding of what their victim is dealing with. They have a good understanding of what information the SANE is getting, and how we can corroborate what they get versus what we get, so that we can find more information and hold an offender accountable. But again, we talk about their history, clothing, photographs. You can read. You know what it entails, but hopefully your law enforcement officers will also have a good understanding of what happens. Again, advocates, we hammer this home. We talk about the difference between community-based versus systems-based, and how community-based advocates may be more accessible to our victim, and therefore it may be a better choice. And yet we also recognize they cannot share anything with us whatsoever unless waivers are signed, which means that if they do share something with us and no waiver is signed, they could lose their VAWA funding and have to close down, and then nobody gets help. Where systems-based are able to share information with us, but they may not be as accessible as a community-based, depending on the jurisdiction and how busy and how many crime victims advocates we have. They really help with keeping the victim engaged throughout the criminal justice process. That's where we lose a lot of people when their life gets blown up. They find out that friends are leaving them, or they get hate mail on Facebook or whatever because they're ruining some poor guy's life, those types of things. The CVA is so much better at that than law enforcement. Law enforcement can't spend an hour just reassuring their victims. They have to take care of all their victims. And crime victims advocates, for some reason, they just know how to deal with them, and they just know this stuff inside and out. And law enforcement would be foolish not to engage them from the very beginning. And again, they just offer emotional support, and they're just irreplaceable. Let's just put it that way. Again, if you have an agency where they're call takers, they're just going to basically get make sure the victim has medical attention right away. They're going to see if what the victim is stating that it matches within Oregon revised statutes or wherever you're from, the law. You sure want to establish jurisdiction, because nothing's worse than doing a 4-hour interview with your victim and then finding out it occurred in a different place. Although you're more than happy to write the report, but it just doesn't seem right for a victim to have to go through that and then get sent over to another agency. So let's establish that jurisdiction right away. Establish whether there are crime scenes and how many of them, and what the exigency is in getting that evidence. We need to identify witnesses, identify the suspect. Again, most of the time, the suspect is known to the victim, but if it is a stranger assault, we're going to try to identify them as best we can. And then what are the resources we need to start this investigation? Do we need a SANE nurse? Do we need advocacy? Do we need surveillance? Do we need, excuse me, whatever we may need, we need to establish that so that when the case gets picked up by a detective, that the ball is rolling and they're set up for success. Okay, we talk about personal representatives. The Oregon's Constitution dictates in our Victims' Rights Bill that a victim has the right to have a representative with them if they so choose. And we want to take care of our victims' needs as best we can. The most we can do is offer options, because there are times where it becomes very difficult. When our victim shows up to the police department and says, I want my husband here while I do my interview, that could be problematic. If she engaged in consensual activity aside from rape or short of rape, is she likely to share that in front of her husband? Is she likely to share the information that she willingly went to their friend's house to watch Netflix because that husband, or that spouse, I should say, may blame the victim for putting themselves in a position where that could happen? So it becomes very difficult when they want that personal representative. So we have to use our words very carefully, because we want to give them what they need, but we also need to see any barriers to getting full information that may be present depending on who they bring in. Obviously, we facilitate comfort and choice, like I said. We acknowledge that this is an ordeal. We have to be unbiased. We have to be neutral. So we have to do it very generically. We don't say, I'm sorry you were raped, because that is a conclusion that they were raped. But we can say, I know that this is very, very difficult for people to come in and talk to me about things that you're here to talk to me about. Obviously, we're going to use our trauma-informed interview. Don't connect the dots, expand the dots, understand trauma brain. And then afterwards, which I do off camera, is answer questions about the process. Only because I think that it can be misconstrued as what's going on, as far as, like, if they say, well, I don't have health insurance, I can't go to the hospital because I can't get a rape kit because I don't have health insurance. We can answer those questions. Well, the rape kit process will be done at no expense to you. Any injuries you may incur because of it, we can't guarantee that that will be covered. But then you give a defense attorney an opportunity, they'll say, see, you just gave her a free checkup at the hospital. That's why she disclosed. So we have to balance that out with answering the questions with the understanding that they could come back and bite you. Next slide, please. We try, what we teach in the academy is we try to teach that our victims are in control. They get to dictate the steps. We can only offer the options. We don't give advice because what may be good for one victim is not good for another. But we give them the options and we tell them the risk reward based on what their choice is. We tell them step by step what is happening. We teach them about anonymous safe kits if that's the route they want to go. We talk about personal representative. Hopefully, we can get our victims to engage with an advocate. We talk about sexual assault protection orders. And again, these cases are risk reward. There is a good, it's a fill gap or stop gap for the sexual assault protection order to keep your offender from having contact with your victim. But at the same time, if your investigation's not done and they've been served, then your suspect knows that your victim has come forward and that law enforcement is investigating and they're sharing the information they have up to that point, giving an offender a chance to get rid of evidence, a chance to obtain attorneys, work on a defense with their attorney, those types of things. So again, risk reward, again, it could be very important to keep your offender away from your victim, but it also could come at an expense. This is for people, law enforcement understands this. TV, it shows 6 detectives working one case and they never write reports and they testify for 5 minutes and that's it. In real life, I think I talked to a Portland police detective that had 117 caseload. I couldn't even begin to do that. I don't even understand how that can happen. Average for big, medium to big is around 20, maybe 15. Smaller agencies around 10 going on at the same time. But it takes time because we have to write detailed reports. Most of my reports were around 40 to 50 pages of narrative for each case. That's a lot of typing time and a lot of interviewing time. And search warrants take 4 or 5 hours to get. They're not easy. They have to be reviewed by prosecutors. Any changes that need to be made, any problems that may arise that the prosecutor sees has to be dealt with and fixed, then rewritten, then rechecked. And when that's okay, then you have to hunt down a judge to get the judge to buy in on your probable cause that evidence exists of this certain crime and where it exists. So it's not like on TV. It really isn't. And we do have to follow rules. It's called the Constitution. We believe in due process. I'm not apologetic for that. I think it's very important. What I teach my students is I work each case as though my daughter is the victim and my son is the alleged offender. And that kind of puts it into perspective how hard these cases are. And the Constitution is there to protect everybody who has been accused of a crime, and we want that. So we do want due process, and we don't want to lose evidence in a motion to suppress because we did something wrong. We want to give our victims the opportunity to get through the criminal justice with as least amount of trauma as possible. And having evidence thrown out is very traumatic for a victim. So after you do your follow-up interview, then we're gonna interview outcry witnesses. We're gonna interview eyewitnesses. We are going to interview secondary witnesses. If our victim went to a bar, we're going to interview the bartender. because bartenders and cocktail waitresses, they know who the creepers are. If this person picked up our victim at that bar, chances are very good that they're known by those people. So even if they say, I don't know anything about it, at least we've exhausted that. We talked to friends um, who were with them, victim, prior to or afterwards. Try to get information on how they were prior to, information on how they were afterwards. We can, if they're in school, we can find out how they did after the incident as opposed to before the incident. Um, we write search warrants, micro corroborate everything: the sights, the sounds, the smells, the tastes, the feelings, the what the diagram of the incident where it took place, what that looks like. If my victim says, I just shut down, I couldn't move, so I stared out his window and stared at a tree, I'm going to write a search warrant for that house. I'm going to lay down on that suspect's bed the way she was laying down, and I'm going to take a picture of that tree so that the jury can see from her perspective what she was looking at. Pretext phone calls, again, is risk reward. They're nice to do. It's where the victim will call our alleged offender on a taped line to gather either admissions or confessions, those types of things. But again, since most of our cases are delayed reporting, we really have to deal with the delayed phone call. If it's been 8 months since the incident occurred and they have not seen each other and she's calling out of the blue 8 months later, we really need a good foundation for why she is calling. We have to interview the suspect. And again, it's not like on TV. Interviewing the suspect, if you're confident that your suspect did do this offense, then there are going to be two things that stop that interview. Either A, your suspect invokes his right to counsel or right to remain silent, or B, he confesses. Those are our only two choices. They can last for hours. And so we need to be able to set up with our suspect a time that we have no time set for anything else that day, because it could take that long. We have to make the choice. Do we take our offender to jail, or do we release them pending further investigation? Again, risk reward. If we take our suspect to jail and then we discover another suspect through our investigation, interviewing that suspect about that second victim is not going to happen because they've been afforded an attorney. An attorney will tell them, don't talk to the police from here on out. We can go to grand jury afterwards if there's felonies, where we basically present our case with no defense. And if the jury feels as though you have enough information to move forward on an indictment, they'll do that. And then court afterwards, which can be 3-4 years later. Or they can cop a plea. It just depends on how the prosecutor wants to deal with that particular court case. Okay, so why is this so important? I think the very last slide in this presentation is what if issues arise. And I think this slide kind of deals with it a little bit, because there are going to be times when you may get a slug for an officer. I'm not talking down on officers. I love officers. I was one of them. I love law enforcement. But every once in a while, you get somebody that just is not engaged. So what do you do in that situation? My suggestion to you is these items. 1, get to know the officers in your jurisdiction. Get to know who is who, how they work, what they believe, because at least you'll be able to know what you're in for when you get that officer in and you've never met them before. Do ride-alongs. I know that's part of your curriculum for SANE, but do more than a minimum if you can. Not that you have all the time in the world, because I'm sure you don't, but you really get to know officers and what they do when you do a ride-along. It really helps. And most importantly, join your sexual assault response team. Build up your SART. Get to know the officers. Go over protocols with them so that when issues do arise, you're not starting off stranger to stranger. You know each other. You know what your intentions are. And then officers are more likely to accept helpful criticism if they know you ahead of time. If they've just met you, they're type A personalities. That's what gets them through their shift. They have to be that way. But it doesn't bode well for colleagues when they point something out when when the officer's supposed to know everything about everything and can't let on that they don't. It becomes embarrassing for them and they become defensive. But if you join your SART, if you join your sexual assault response team, then you have a leg in. Then you're on common ground and you can really talk about issues. And then maybe attend an officer briefing once in a while, if they'll let you go in. They may have some confidential information they can't share with the public, but if you set a time out with the sergeant saying, hey, can I get 5 minutes of your briefing time just to introduce myself and get to know your officers, that will go a long, long way. So again, when issues do arise, hopefully you're part of the SART. Hopefully you've gotten to know your officers, at least some of them, so you have somebody an in with the police department. But also, if you see somebody that is just ruining somebody's life because they're doing everything wrong, not that I'm saying that officers don't know how to interview, but they have to be experts at everything. It's not just non-stranger sexual assault. It's not just DUI investigation. It's not burglary investigation. It's use of force response and defensive tactics and driving and firearms and de-escalation and mental health. We have to be good at everything. And I don't think anybody's good at everything. So if you do have a problem, be respectful. If you can't get through to the officer and you feel that the victim's life is going to be changed for the negative, then call a supervisor and just say, this is what I believe. This is what I saw. This is what I saw the officer do. I'm not telling him how to do his job. I can just tell you the effect it had on the victim for what I saw really was negative. And hopefully the supervisor will seek out training for that officer if they haven't learned. Hopefully the sergeant or supervisor will respond in a positive manner, and hopefully the relationship between you and that officer in the future will just get better and better and better. So we covered about 2.5 days of information, which means you got very little, if any. But I do want to thank all of you for what you do, especially with this COVID and the fact that you guys are even taking on more responsibility with working to be a SANE is just unbelievable. So on behalf of me and the rest of the country, thank you.